Let me be direct with you from the outset, because the story being told about the Beirut port reconstruction is one of the most carefully managed narratives in the Middle East today. The official story, the one being promoted by Western governments, international financial institutions, and certain Lebanese political factions, is a story about recovery, about resilience, about the international community coming together to rebuild a shattered city. And on the surface, it sounds entirely plausible. A city devastated by one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history, finally receiving the investment it needs to restore its position as the commercial gateway of the Eastern Mediterranean. That story is real. The construction is real. The cranes are real. The financing meetings in Paris and Washington are real. But what is also real, and what nobody in the mainstream press is connecting with the necessary precision, is the strategic architecture being built alongside the physical infrastructure. Because the question of who builds the Beirut port, who finances it, who controls the data systems that manage its traffic, and who positions themselves to dominate the logistics of a reconstructed Lebanese economy, is not a humanitarian question. It is a geopolitical question of the first order. And the answers to that question tell you far more about where the Middle East is heading than any ceasefire announcement or diplomatic communique. In the next 18 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly what is being built in Beirut, who is building it, who is financing it, who is being excluded, and why the reconstruction of this specific port in this specific moment is a proxy contest for influence over the entire Levant. This is not speculation. This is documented, sourced, and verifiable. Subscribe now if you have not already, because this level of analysis is not available in the mainstream coverage of Lebanon. To understand why Beirut's port matters beyond Lebanon itself, you need to understand what Beirut historically was and what it could again become. Before the civil war that began in 1975, Beirut was the banking capital of the Arab world. It was the transit hub for goods moving between Europe, the Gulf, and Asia. Its port was the entry point for a significant portion of the commerce flowing into Syria, Jordan, and parts of Iraq. Lebanese banks held accounts for Gulf royalty, Palestinian diaspora savings, and European corporations seeking a footprint in the Arab market simultaneously. This was not accidental. It was the product of a specific geography, a specific legal architecture of relative openness, and a specific cosmopolitan culture that made Beirut uniquely capable of serving as a bridge. The 2020 explosion destroyed 80% of the port's operational infrastructure, killed over 200 people, injured more than 6,000, and displaced approximately 300,000 residents from surrounding neighborhoods, according to figures from the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. The grain silos that were partially destroyed continue to partially stand as a monument to the neglect that made the explosion possible. 2,750 metric tons of ammonium nitrate stored unsafely for 6 years, while successive Lebanese governments ignored warnings from their own customs officials. But here is what nobody is adequately explaining. The reconstruction of the Beirut port is not happening in a vacuum. It is happening in the context of a broader post-conflict reorganization of the entire Levantine economic space. Syria is emerging from over a decade of war with a new political structure and desperate need for a functional port access route, which are not sharp and dual bytes. Iraq has been investing billions in its own FAW Grand Port project in the south, but FAW is a decade from full operational capacity. The Abraham Accords have created new trade corridors between Israel and Gulf states that bypass Lebanon entirely. And the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative has been investing heavily in port infrastructure, from Piraeus in Greece to Haifa in Israel to Oman's Duqm port. Every major power with interest in the Eastern Mediterranean is looking at the Beirut reconstruction not as a charity project, but as a positioning exercise. Announcement number one, the French bid and what Paris is actually trying to protect. France has positioned itself as the lead Western actor in the Beirut reconstruction process. This is not surprising. France has historical ties to Lebanon, dating to the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Mandate period. France has a francophone cultural relationship with Lebanon's Christian and Druze communities. And France, under successive presidents, has maintained a self-image as the protecting power of Lebanese sovereignty. The French company CMA CGM, the world's third largest container shipping company, headquartered in Marseille, has been in active discussions about a long-term management concession for the reconstructed port. According to reporting by L'Orient Today and confirmed by multiple Lebanese business press sources, CMA CGM has offered a package that includes operational management, logistics software systems, and investment in cold storage and container terminal expansion. But here is what the coverage of the French bid does not adequately explain. CMA CGM's port management would give a French company data access to every container, every shipment, every commercial transaction flowing through the Beirut port. In an era when logistics data is as strategically valuable as oil, that is not a commercial concession. That is an intelligence architecture. The United States learned this lesson with Huawei and 5G networks. The principle is identical. Whoever controls the data systems of a major port knows the commercial patterns of every country and company using it. According to analysis published in the Journal of Strategic Studies and cross-referenced with reporting from Reuters on port infrastructure investment patterns across the Mediterranean, the competition for port data systems in the Eastern Mediterranean has intensified dramatically since 2022. Every major port, from Alexandria to Piraeus to Ashdod to Tripoli, is now a site of competition between Western-aligned technology providers and Chinese alternatives. Beirut is simply the most contested because of its unique position at the intersection of Lebanese domestic politics, post-war Syrian economic recovery, and the broader question of who dominates Levantine trade for the next half-century. Received. That is announcement number one. Announcement number two, the Chinese presence and why it is more significant than official statements suggest. China has not made a public bid for the Beirut port reconstruction contract. This is deliberate. Lebanese politics are complicated enough without adding an explicit China versus West competition that would trigger American pressure on Lebanese decision makers through the IMF loan conditionality process, which Lebanon desperately needs. But the absence of a public Chinese bid does not mean the absence of Chinese interest or Chinese activity. According to multiple Lebanese economic analysts and reporting by Arab business press sources, including Al Monitor and the Beirut-based financial publication Executive Magazine, Chinese companies have been quietly meeting with Lebanese Port Authority officials, logistics firms, and infrastructure investors since late 2023. These meetings have focused specifically on three areas: warehouse management systems, which are the software backbone of port operations; cold chain logistics infrastructure, which Lebanon needs to develop its food export capacity; and rail and road connectivity, studies linking the port to potential Reconstruction-era Syrian transit routes. Stay with me, because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the reconstruction story becomes something far larger than Lebanon. If Syria's reconstruction proceeds under a government that maintains some level of working relationship with both Iran and China, the question of which port that Reconstruction-era Syrian trade flows through becomes an enormous commercial and strategic prize. Pre-war, Syria's trade was almost entirely routed through the port of Latakia or overland through Lebanon's Beirut port. A reconstructed Syria with restored commercial capacity would generate container traffic volumes that would make whoever controls Beirut's port operations extremely wealthy and strategically influential. China has a simple calculation here. Belt and road infrastructure in Syria, Iraqi reconstruction investment, and port positioning in Beirut could create a contiguous logistics corridor from the Persian Gulf to the Eastern Mediterranean. That corridor would reduce Chinese export dependence on the Suez Canal choke point by creating an overland alternative for certain cargo categories. Announcement number 3, and this is the one that the Western press is consistently failing to place in its correct strategic context. Hezbollah's position on the reconstruction and what it reveals about the internal Lebanese power struggle. Hezbollah has publicly supported the Beirut port reconstruction while remaining carefully ambiguous about which foreign partners it prefers. This ambiguity is not accidental. Hezbollah's political calculation is specific. A French-managed port integrated into Western financial systems would increase pressure on Lebanese banks to comply with American secondary sanctions in ways that would constrain Hezbollah's financial networks. A Chinese-managed port would not come with the same compliance architecture. But Hezbollah also understands that openly endorsing the Chinese option would trigger exactly the kind of American pressure on the Lebanese government that would delay reconstruction indefinitely. So Hezbollah is doing what it frequently does in Lebanese domestic politics. It is allowing other actors to fight the initial battle while positioning itself to influence the outcome at the critical moment of decision. According to analysts at the Carnegie Middle East Center, this is a recognizable pattern from previous Lebanese infrastructure disputes, including the telecommunications sector debates of the early 2000s and the electricity generation contracts of 2010 to 2015. Hezbollah does not need to win the public argument. It needs to be present at the table when the private decision is made. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now, let us talk about what the mainstream coverage is getting fundamentally wrong, because there is a framing problem at the heart of how Western media is covering the Beirut reconstruction. The dominant Western narrative presents the reconstruction as a test of Lebanese governance. The question being asked publicly is whether Lebanon can implement the reforms that the IMF and Western donors are demanding in exchange for the financial support that reconstruction requires. Judicial independence, banking sector reform, anti-corruption mechanisms, customs modernization. These are presented as preconditions for international investment, and Lebanon's failure to implement them is presented as the primary obstacle to reconstruction progress. This framing is not wrong. Lebanon has genuinely catastrophic governance problems. The sectarian political system has produced spectacular corruption and regulatory failure. The ammonium nitrate that exploded in 2020 was a symptom of this failure. But the framing is incomplete in a way that serves specific interests. Because while Western governments and the IMF are conditioning financial support on governance reforms that Lebanese politics makes nearly impossible to implement, they are simultaneously watching Chinese and Iranian alternatives position themselves in the gaps that Western conditionality creates. The governance conditions are not wrong in principle. They are counterproductive in practice if they are used as a mechanism to delay reconstruction rather than facilitate it, because the delay does not produce reform. It produces radicalization, economic collapse, and the strengthening of non-Western alternatives. Think carefully about what this means. The International Monetary Fund, according to its own published documentation on Lebanon negotiations, has been in discussions with Lebanese authorities since 2022 without reaching a final agreement. The conditions being required are real conditions, but the effect of the conditionality is also real. It is producing exactly the environment in which the actors Western policy is supposedly designed to counter are most effectively able to operate. There is a historical parallel here. Consider what happened in Afghanistan in the late 1970s and into the 1980s. The United States, the Soviet Union, and regional powers all had plans for Afghanistan's development and modernization, each conditioned on Afghan governments accepting frameworks of alignment that Afghan political reality could not sustain. The result was not the implementation of anyone's plan. The result was the progressive collapse of the Afghan state and the empowerment of actors who cared nothing for any of the competing visions of Afghan development. The Beirut situation is not Afghanistan. The analogy is not exact, but the structural pattern, external powers conditioning support on compliance with frameworks that internal politics cannot deliver while watching non-compliant alternatives fill the space, is recognizable. History does not repeat, but it rhymes with uncomfortable regularity. So where does this leave us? 3 paths. Path 1, the Lebanese political establishment, under sufficient IMF and Western donor pressure, combined with genuine public exhaustion with the current system, implements enough reform to unlock the international financing package. A Western-aligned consortium led by French logistics interests takes the port management concession. The Beirut port becomes a functioning Western-integrated commercial hub, reducing Chinese and Iranian positioning opportunities. This outcome would require Lebanese political actors to accept short-term losses for long-term institutional gains. Based on 30 years of Lebanese political history, this is possible but not probable. Path 2, the reform process continues to stall, financing continues to be delayed, and the infrastructure vacuum is filled incrementally by smaller deals, Chinese equipment suppliers, Iranian-linked construction firms, and Gulf state investors with their own political conditions. The Beirut port is reconstructed, but without coherent strategic direction, producing a patchwork of competing interests that mirrors the patchwork of Lebanese sectarian politics. This is the most likely outcome. It is also the outcome that leaves Lebanon permanently vulnerable and permanently contested. Path 3, a regional shock, either another conflict involving Hezbollah, a Syrian political crisis, or a Gulf financial crisis, forces an acceleration of decisions that the current slow-motion diplomacy cannot produce. In this scenario, whoever is best positioned at the moment of forced decision wins the port question by default. China's quiet preparatory work and Iran's political relationships may produce a very different outcome than Western diplomatic engagement currently anticipates. I think Path 2 is where we are heading, with elements of Path 3 depending on events in Syria over the next 6 months. Here are the questions I want you to take away. If China secures a significant role in Beirut port management without a public bid process, what does that tell us about the effectiveness of Western conditionality as a strategic tool in the Middle East? If the Beirut port is reconstructed in the next 5 years, primarily with Gulf Arab financing, what does that mean for the independence of Lebanese foreign policy? And if you are a Lebanese citizen watching this from Beirut right now, what exactly is the Western promise worth if it is conditioned on reforms that the political system cannot deliver? Tell me in the comments what you think the most underreported dimension of this story is. Tell me whether you believe Western conditionality is a genuine commitment to Lebanese reform or a strategic delay tactic that serves other interests. We will keep tracking every development in the Beirut reconstruction, in Lebanese politics, and in the broader contest for influence across the Levant. Subscribe now. The Spoor Star in Tarsin Bor in the share this analysis. And turn on notifications, and we will see you in the next one. What makes the Beirut port question particularly revealing is the way it exposes the internal contradictions of how Western governments simultaneously pursue commercial interests, strategic positioning, and humanitarian rhetoric in the same theater. French government support for CMA-CGM's port management bid is simultaneously a commercial policy supporting a French national champion, a strategic policy extending French influence in the Levant, and a humanitarian policy framed as support for Lebanese recovery. These 3 objectives are not always compatible with each other. When they conflict, as they inevitably do in a context as politically complex as Lebanon's, the humanitarian framing tends to give way to the strategic and commercial priorities. This is not cynicism. It is a structural observation about how great power engagement with fragile states operates in practice. The United States made similar choices in Iraq, where reconstruction contracts went to American firms with political connections, while the actual reconstruction produced results that fell dramatically short of the promises made to the Iraqi public. The pattern of commercial and strategic interests operating through a humanitarian framing is not unique to France in Lebanon. It is the standard operating procedure of great power engagement with post-conflict fragile states. The reason this observation matters specifically for the Beirut port situation is that Lebanese public opinion is not naive about this pattern. Lebanese citizens have lived through multiple cycles of international attention, international promises, international conferences, and international failures to deliver meaningful reconstruction or accountability. The Taif Agreement was supposed to end the civil war and produce genuine reform. The Saint-Cloud Conference was supposed to address the banking crisis. The Cedric Conference of 2018 was supposed to unlock reconstruction investment. Each generated diplomatic attention and statements of commitment. None produced the structural changes that would have made Lebanon genuinely less fragile. The Beirut port reconstruction is the latest iteration of this cycle. If it follows the established pattern, the outcome will be a partially reconstructed port operating at reduced capacity, controlled by a consortium that reflects the political balance of the moment rather than the operational logic of a functioning commercial hub, and serving neither the Lebanese economy nor the strategic interests of any of the competing external actors as effectively as any of them intended. The garbage in the streets of Beirut is not just a metaphor. It is the empirical result of 30 years of international engagement with Lebanese governance that prioritized political management over institutional development. The question worth asking is not which external actor will win the Beirut port competition. It is whether the competition itself, by injecting geopolitical calculations into what should be a technical infrastructure decision, will produce yet another outcome that falls short of what the Lebanese people actually need. Based on the evidence of the past 30 years, the answer is probably yes. And based on the evidence of the past 30 years, nobody in a position to change that outcome will be held accountable for it. Subscribe now. Share this analysis, turn on notifications, and we will see you in the next one. There is one more dimension of this story that I want to leave you with because it concerns not the geopolitics of the port reconstruction, but the human stakes that underlie the geopolitical competition. Beirut is a city of approximately 2 million people. It is a city with a literary tradition, a culinary tradition, a cosmopolitan history that made it genuinely one of the remarkable urban environments of the 20th century. The explosion of 2020 did not destroy a strategic asset. It destroyed a city. It destroyed homes, businesses, cultural institutions, the accumulated physical memory of generations. The reconstruction of the port is necessary because the port is economically essential. But the reconstruction of the port does not automatically produce the reconstruction of the city or the restoration of the conditions that made Beirut worth caring about. What Beirut actually needs is not a French logistics company or a Chinese equipment supplier. What it needs is a Lebanese political system capable of making decisions in the interest of Lebanese citizens rather than in the interest of sectarian leaders or external patrons. That political system does not currently exist. It cannot be created by any foreign port management concession or any IMF conditional loan. It can only be created by Lebanese citizens through the kind of sustained political struggle that produced the 2019 protest movement before that movement was absorbed and neutralized by the same political class it was attempting to displace. The port reconstruction will happen. The cranes will operate. The containers will move. But whether what is rebuilt serves Lebanon or continues to serve the external actors competing for influence through Lebanese infrastructure is a question that no foreign power, no international financial institution, and no diplomatic conference can answer for the Lebanese people. Tell me in the comments what you think the most underreported dimension of this story is. We will keep tracking every development in the Beirut reconstruction and the broader contest for influence across the Levant. I want to add one final layer to this analysis before closing because it concerns the role of Gulf Arab states in the Beirut port question, and it is a dimension that the French versus Chinese framing consistently obscures. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE all have significant interests in the trajectory of Lebanese reconstruction. Saudi Arabia cut off its financial support for Lebanon's military and withdrew its ambassador in 2021 over what Riyadh described as Hezbollah's dominance of Lebanese foreign policy and Lebanon's failure to prevent Hezbollah weapons shipments to the Houthis in Yemen. That diplomatic rupture has partially healed, but the underlying Saudi conditions for re-engagement with Lebanon remain specific and politically difficult for any Lebanese government to fully satisfy. Qatar, by contrast, has maintained engagement with Lebanon throughout the crisis period, hosting Lebanese political dialogues and providing humanitarian assistance. Qatar's interest in the port reconstruction reflects its broader strategy of maintaining relationships with all Lebanese political communities, including Hezbollah, which gives it a different kind of access than Saudi Arabia currently has. The Qatari approach to Lebanon: maintain relationships across the political spectrum, provide financial support without demanding the political changes that would actually require Lebanese political actors to lose something, is simultaneously more pragmatically effective in the short term and more structurally permissive of the dysfunction that produces the crises requiring the Qatari interventions in the first place. This is the fundamental paradox of external engagement with Lebanon. Every actor that wants influence needs to work through the existing political system. Working through the existing political system perpetuates the system. The system perpetuates the crises. The crises require external engagement. External engagement perpetuates the system. The loop is closed. Breaking it would require external actors to accept a period of reduced influence, while Lebanese political institutions are reformed in ways that make them less accessible to external manipulation. No external actor has shown the willingness to accept that trade-off because the reduced influence period would benefit their competitors. And so the loop continues.